What's up, church family? This is Tim Tebow. I want to say thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for saying yes to partnering with us for Night to Shine. What is Night to Shine? Night to Shine is a worldwide prom for people with special needs. But actually more than that, we believe it's a worldwide movement. And we're so grateful that your church, that you have decided to say yes to partnering with us on this movement to celebrate everyone. And when we say everyone, we really mean it. We mean all, because everyone is worth celebrating. Everybody needs to hear that they are loved, that they are valuable, that they were created on purpose for a purpose. You know, 15% of the world's population has some form of special need, and it's the most underserved population around the world. But we together get to change that. Thank you for saying yes to this mission. Thank you for saying yes to this calling, because there are so many people that need us so that they can hear that they're loved, so that they can feel special, so that they can walk down with you on a red carpet, or they can see you cheer for them, or they can see you clap them, or maybe you're the one that is going to put a crown or a tiara on their head. And maybe at that moment, they're going to realize, wow, I am valuable. Wow, I am loved. Wow. Maybe this is done for me. Maybe that's how much they love me. So we don't just believe that Night to Shine is a prom. We believe it's a movement where people get to understand and discover their God-given worth. So thank you so much for saying yes. Now, let's go get to them. Let's go love them. Let's go get to that 15% because they are worthy.
Yeah, we have Night to Shine coming up a week from Friday, and it is absolutely one of the best nights maybe the best night of the year here at Free Church, and it's the only one in northern Michigan, and we already have, I think it's like 200 who have registered, 200 individuals with special needs who have registered. There'll be a lot more than that coming in before then, and it is such a special night. And I hope that Tim Tebow's passion connected with you, because the key is we need a lot of volunteers. That's the key. And all you got to do is be able to show love. That's all you got to be able to do. And what a need it's meeting. You know, we have a special needs ministry at our church now on a weekly basis, Sunday morning, Wednesday night, special events like Kids Camp. And it all started with our first Night to Shine. I was talking this week with one of the radio personalities at WLJN Radio, and we were talking about Night to Shine, and they were promoting it, and we were just talking about some things, and this individual shared with me their story, their family story, of how it was difficult to go to church because of an individual with special needs, and having something for that person. And here at Free Church, we have the incredible opportunity, not just one night a year at Night to Shine, but all year long, to be able to minister to these families. And so we would love to have you be part of this year's Night to Shine. I'm going to guarantee you, if you're part of it once, you'll be part of it every year. You won't miss it. And so if you want more information, it's out in the hub. I hope you'll be part. And we welcome now all of our campuses in, our Sault Ste. Marie campus, and we welcome as well our online campus, our TV audience. Those who are listening live right now on our partner radio station, the Eagle 101.5 FM, we welcome you. Thank you for listening. And those who are part of our affiliates on Bois Blanc Island, down at the Tall Timbers Church, we just welcome all of you right now. And if you're right now in the main auditorium or at our Sioux campus or down at the classic service, we invite you to fill out one of those tickets that's in front of you. Regular attenders can turn those in the giving boxes in the back. You can also give online at myefree.org. But if you're a first-time guest with us here in the main auditorium, especially, I want to encourage you, hold on to that card. And when the service is over, I'll be out in the hub by the cafe. I'd love to meet you, connect with you. Bring me that card. We have a free gift bag for you. If you're up at our Sioux campus, I know Jeff would love to connect with you after the service as well. So if you're a first-time guest, I hope you will bring that card out, meet me, and just let us have a few minutes to connect. Well, this morning, we're going to continue our series through the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel, and we've got 3 weeks left. And today we move from chapter 4 to chapter 5. And I've entitled today's message, When the Handwriting is on the Wall. And I'm sure you've heard that phrase before. Maybe you've used it. Yeah, the handwriting's on the wall. This is a phrase that literally originates in the Bible. in Daniel chapter 5. Now, before we talk about exactly what happens in Daniel chapter 5, it's important that I give you some historical backdrop. And here's why. Chapter 4 ends with the death of Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled for over 40 years in Babylon. Now, when chapter 5 opens, we're going to meet another individual named Belshazzar. And at the end of chapter 5, Belshazzar is going to die, and the Babylonian kingdom is going to come to an end. Now, in between chapter 4 and chapter 5, you have to understand, there's a 23-year gap. It didn't just move from Nebuchadnezzar to Belshazzar. There's a 23-year gap between chapter 4 and chapter 5. For the first 6 years of that gap, it was nothing but political turmoil in the kingdom. When Nebuchadnezzar dies in 562 BC, his only son succeeds him on the throne. But he's only on the throne for 2 years. And in 560 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's son is murdered by his brother-in-law. And his brother-in-law takes the throne. However, he dies, and in 556 BC, the brother-in-law's son takes the throne. You say, why aren't you giving us the names? Trust me, you don't want to hear all the names, all right? The brother-in-law's son now takes the throne. But shortly after his ascension, he's assassinated. And after his assassination, a new king is put into place. This king's name is Nabonidus. And Nabonidus will be the king all the way until the fall of Babylon. Nabonidus is not mentioned in chapter 5, but he's the king. But here's the thing. Nabonidus was married years earlier to one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters. So Nabonidus is married to the daughter of King Nebuchadnezzar, and they have a child. And that child's name is Belshazzar. And Belshazzar is the person mentioned in chapter 5, and here's why. Because Nabonidus, though he was king, he did not like living in Babylon. He enjoyed traveling. He didn't want to be bothered with king duties. He just wanted the title and the wealth. So while he was traveling abroad, he chose his son, Belshazzar, to be the co-regent. So Belshazzar is now the one who is running Babylon. He's kind of king number 2. He's running it for his father, Nabonidus. Now, why is that important? Because in chapter 5, Belshazzar is going to say to Daniel, if you can interpret this writing on the wall, I will make you third ruler in Babylon. And people go, why third ruler? Well, because ruler number 1 was who? Nabonidus. Ruler number 3 was Belshazzar. So the highest Daniel could go was ruler number 3. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is this. We're going to see in the story in chapter 5 a queen mentioned. Now, this queen is not Belshazzar's wife. We know that because in Daniel 5, Belshazzar is having a huge party. We'll talk about that in a moment. And all of his wives are at the party. So when the queen comes in, she's not his wife. She's either his mother, which would have been the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, if I haven't lost you yet. Or it is possible that it might be the widow of Nebuchadnezzar, who 23 years later was still alive. But whoever this queen is, be it the mother of Belshazzar or the widow of Nebuchadnezzar, she knows the story of Daniel, and that will play a big factor. Now, another thing I want to note before we get into the story is this. It's been 23 years in between chapter 4 and chapter 5. However, it's been roughly 67, nearly 70 years since Daniel was first taken into captivity and exile. Now remember back in chapter 1 when Daniel gets taken and deported to Babylon, from Jerusalem to Babylon, he's somewhere between 13 and 15 years old. At least 67 years have gone by, which means Daniel, as chapter 5 opens, is in his 80s. He's in probably his early 80s, 80, 81, 82, maybe 83 years old. He is no longer a spring chicken. He is no longer a teenager right out of Jerusalem. Now, with that in mind, let me ask you a question. How many of you here in the main auditorium, down at our classic service, or up at the Sioux campus, online, you can also participate if you want by chiming in the comments section. How many of you are age 80 or older? Raise your hand. And I'm sure there's a larger percentage of hands down in the classic service right now, right? And some of you might be thinking, whoa, wait, time out. Why are you making people reveal their age? That's rude. Well, keep something in mind about the way we do age in our culture. It's fascinating if you think about it. When you were first born, you are identified age-wise by weeks, aren't you? How old is your baby? 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 18 weeks, 20 weeks. But then when you reach about age 2, it changes. And now suddenly you're identified by half years. How old are you? 2.5, 6.5, 12.5. And then you reach about 16, 17, 18, and it changes again. And now you're identified by years. How old are you? 18, 19, 20, 21. And that lasts till about the time you hit 30. And then it changes again. And beginning age 30, you're now identified by decades. Right? Hey, how old are you? Oh, I'm in my 60s. Well, I mean 69. It just sounds better. I'd say in my 60s, right? But when you reach 80, it changes again. And suddenly at age 80, you wear your age like a badge of honor. And well, you should. What an accomplishment. Every month I lead a service over at the Brook Assisted Living Facility and over at the Porches Assisted Living Facility. And everyone that comes to that service at both those places, they're well over 80, over 90. And every one of them, when I first meet them, the first thing they need to tell me is how old they are, right? Because now you're wearing it like a badge of honor. And I love the fact that in this story, Daniel has reached that point. He's in his 80s. And I want you to know, if you're part of our church, and there's many of you here at the Sioux, Classic, online, watching on TV, if you're part of our church and you're in your 80s, can I just say this to you? God, like Daniel, still wants to use you to impact your culture. He still wants to use you to impact your church. We need you. We need your prayers. We need your encouragement. We need you to serve. We need your inheritance, but that's a different story. But we need all of that, right? As a church, because even once you reach that age 80, God still wants to use you. I just got an email this morning from an individual who says, I'm 83 years old, watching your broadcast, and I just prayed to receive Christ. Will you send me a Bible? I thought, how cool is that an 83-year-old gets saved watching our and how cool that they know how to email. How cool is it that they can do all of that? And we're going to say, when I was a kid, I used to love to read the stories in the Bible of young people that did great things for God. David and Goliath, Daniel, Timothy, because I said, man, I can do great things for God as a teenager. Next month, I turn 58. So now I realize I'm a whole lot closer to 80 than I am to my teenage years. And now I get excited when I'm reading the Bible and see people like Daniel and Caleb and other old geezers who are still serving God, to say it doesn't matter how old I get, I can still serve God. Let me point out one more thing that we'll get into the chapter. How's this for introduction? One thing. In this chapter 5, Nebuchadnezzar is going to be referred to as Belshazzar's father. Now, we know from the history I just gave you, Belshazzar was not the son of Nebuchadnezzar. He was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. So why is he referred to as Nebuchadnezzar referred to as his father, and here's why. Because in that culture and in the Aramaic language, they did not have a word for grandfather. They used the same word for all the male descendants, father. Now, see, again, that's different than our culture. In our culture, when a baby's born, you become a father. Now, if you do a really, really good job of being a father, you get to become a grandfather. And if you do a really good job of being a grandfather, you get to become a great-grandfather. And if you do a really, really good job of being a great-grandfather and you live long enough, you just might get the title great-great-grandfather. But in the Babylonian Empire, they were all considered fathers. That's all. They use the same word for all of them. That's why you'll see that in the text. All right, with that as a historical backdrop, let's move in to Daniel chapter 5. I want to start reading in verse number 1, okay? It says, Belshazzar, we just talked about who that is, right? The grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, the co-regent of Babylon. Belshazzar the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles. So this is a large feast, which is very common in that day. And he was drinking wine in the presence of the... So the only thing... what's the number one thing the king's doing at the party? He's drinking wine. That's what he's doing. I almost entitled the message, "It's my party, I'll drink if I want to." So this is Belshazzar. That's what he's doing to open things up. Now look at verse 2. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar, his father, now we know that's grandfather, had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, and note this, his wives and his concubines, they're also at the party, might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God which was in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised their idols, their gods that have been made of gold, made of silver, made of bronze, made of iron, made of wood, made of stone. So there's this huge party going on in the palace. Now, there's 3 things you need to know about this party. Number 1, this party is centered around immorality. It is centered around immorality. How do we know that? Because who's at the party? The wives and the concubines. Now, folks, in this culture, when there was official state parties, official state dinners, as we might call them, it was always done with separate gender. The king would host the men, the queen would host the women in a separate room. You can see that in the story of Esther. But in this particular case, it's not separate genders. They're all together. And it's not just the wives. The concubines are there. And they exist in the palace for one purpose: sexual pleasure of the king. You can read, I don't recommend it because it will corrupt your mind, but you can read accounts of what these parties were like. These parties centered around immorality. To use a modern-day crass term, and I apologize in advance, but I want you to understand what's going on here. This was a drunken orgy. That's what this was in the palace. So it's centered around immorality. Number 2, it's centered around idiocy. In other words, Belshazzar's being an idiot. I would have rather used the word stupidity, but some of you teach your kids not to use the word stupid, so I won't say stupidity from the stage. So it's centered around immorality, and it's centered around idiocy. He's being an idiot. How do we know this? Here's why. Because history records. History records that while they're having this drunken orgy in the palace, the armies of the Medes and the Persians have surrounded the city. They're wanting to take down the city. They're wanting to devastate the city. They want to conquer the city. What do you think you should be doing when the enemy has surrounded your house? Not what Belshazzar's doing. So this party is centered around immorality, it is centered around idiocy, and it is centered around idolatry. And this idolatry includes mockery. He calls for the golden vessels to be brought in. The vessels that, if you remember in chapter 1, his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, when he invaded Jerusalem, brought from the temple of God in Jerusalem to Babylon. These were the golden vessels that had been used in the worship of the God of Israel. And now Belshazzar and his wives and his concubines and all these nobles are using them in this drunken feast of debauchery. And while they're mocking the God of Israel, they are worshiping the idols in the room that were made by human hands. Idols made of wood, of stone, of gold, of silver, of bronze. That's what's going on in the palace. Now, as we move to verse number 5, we discover this. An uninvited guest crashes the party. An uninvited guest crashes the party. Look at verse 5. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Now, how does the king, what effect does this have on the king? He sees these fingers, not a person, fingers, and they're writing on the wall. And it says 4 things about how the king responded. Number 1, the king's face grew pale. He became white as a ghost. His thoughts alarmed him. He is filled with fear. His hip joints went slack. What does that mean? Well, let's just put it this way. He had to go change his tunic afterwards, and we'll leave it right there. And his knees began knocking together. So what happens? Out of nowhere, with no warning, these fingers appear and write on the wall. I read this and I chuckle because I can't help but thinking of the Addams family. Remember Thing, the hand that would kind of come out of the box? It's like, well, this is, we saw the Wolf Man a couple weeks ago. This could be a Halloween series we could be doing here, right? Amazing. Amazing. The king is scared. So what does the king do? He calls in all of his advisors, all of his sorcerers, who you're going to call Ghostbusters. That's who he calls. And none of them can interpret the writing on the wall. Well, the queen hears about this. The queen's not at the party. It's not his wife. This is either his mother or Nebuchadnezzar's widow. And she comes in. Because this queen obviously knows the story of Daniel from Nebuchadnezzar's day, 23 years earlier. And she tells Belshazzar all about Daniel and how Daniel had the spirit of the gods on him. And how King Nebuchadnezzar used Daniel to interpret dreams and reveal mysteries. And so Belshazzar right now, he is desperate. So he calls in Daniel. And we pick up the story in verse 13. Here's what it says. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard about you." Folks, people have heard about you. The question is, what have they heard? You have a reputation spiritually. The question is, what is that reputation? I've heard about you. That a spirit of the gods is in you. That illumination, insight, extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Now, just now, the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me that they might read the inscription and make its interpretation known, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally, he says it again, I heard about you, that you're able to give interpretations, you're able to solve difficult problems. So, if you're able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, I'll clothe you with purple, you'll put on a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Why the third ruler? Because number 1 is Nabonidus, number 2 is Belshazzar. So the king says, okay, if you can do it, I'm going to promote you. What's your answer, Daniel? Now, As we keep reading, we discover Daniel is not interested in the reward at all, but he will speak the truth of God in a humble way. So look at verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself, or if you want, give them to somebody else. However, I will read the inscription to the king, and I will make the interpretation known to him. Now you would think, would you not, that the next verse would be Daniel saying, here's what the inscription means. But before Daniel gives that meaning, he's going to do something else. He is going to give Belshazzar a history lesson. Look at verse 18. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, your father, or we know grandfather. So what does Daniel do now? Daniel recounts the history of Belshazzar's grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. He reminds Belshazzar of all the glory of Nebuchadnezzar. And we've seen that in our study. An amazing leader with a glorious kingdom, ruled it for 44 years. But we also are reminded by Daniel, as he says to Belshazzar, but let me remind you that there came a point when your grandfather was lifted up with pride. He thought it was all because of him. He discounted the God of all gods, the Most High God. And as a result, the one true God humbled your grandfather. For 7 years, your grandfather lost his kingdom, became like a wild animal eating grass out in the field. We saw that all last week. But then he reminds Belshazzar of this. But 7 years later, your granddaddy came to his senses, and he acknowledged that God is the only Most High God in the world. And he repented. He reminds Belshazzar of his granddaddy's story. And then in verse number 22, he compares Belshazzar with his granddaddy. And look what he says. Yet you, his son, his grandson, Belshazzar, unlike your granddaddy Nebuchadnezzar, you have not humbled your heart. Now here's the key phrase. Even though you knew all this. Let's stop there. Daniel's basically saying this, Belshazzar, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. You know the story of your grandpa. I'm sure your grandpa told you that story before he died. Your mom probably told you that story countless times. You know the story. But here's the problem. Though you know the story, you have never learned from the story. Though you know the story, you have never learned from the story. And folks, I see this on an almost daily basis among followers of Jesus. They know the principles of Scripture. They know the commands of God. They know the examples in the Bible of people who did their own thing and how it never worked out well for them. And even though they know the truth, they know the examples, they know the story, they've never learned from it. And they continue to think that somehow, some way, I can justify my actions and I can get away with it. It's not enough to know the Bible. Folks, you must learn from the Bible. It must dictate your life. And he says, Belshazzar, even though you knew all this, you never learned from it. In fact, verse 23 says, even though you knew it, you've exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. And that was proven in the fact that you brought in the vessels from the Lord of heaven's house. You and your nobles, your wives, your concubines, you drank from them, and as you did, you praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, ones that had to be made by hands. And then notice what he says at the end. these false gods which do not see, do not hear, and do not understand. What's he saying? He's saying, Belshazzar, while you are mocking the Most High God, you are worshiping these idols. You are worshiping idols that cannot see while you mock the Most High God that can see. You are worshiping idols that cannot hear while you are mocking the Most High God who can hear. You are worshiping these false idols that cannot understand while you are mocking the Most High God who does understand. And then in verse 23 he says this. That's an amazing verse. But the God in whose hand are your life, breath, and ways, you have refused to glorify. Note this. Note this. The God in whose hand is your life and your breath, you have not acknowledged. Belshazzar, do you realize you are mocking the very God who holds your life in his hands? You are mocking the very God that controls your breath. Belshazzar, the only reason you can take a breath right now is because the Most High God that you're mocking is allowing you to. Isn't it amazing how we will so often choose to disobey the Most High God who holds our life and breath in his hands? And he says to Belshazzar in verse 24, because of this, the hand was sent from that Most High God, and this inscription was written out. In other words, before I tell you what the inscription means, I want you to know the author of the inscription. It is the Most High God that you're mocking. It is the Most High God, the only one who can hear you, see you, and understand you, that you're mocking. It is the Most High God that holds in his hand your life and your breath that you're mocking. That is the God who wrote this on the wall. And then Daniel, beginning in verse 25, gives the meaning of the writing on the wall. And basically, let me just summarize it. It's 3 words. The first word is transliterated M-E-N-E. The second word is transliterated T-E-K-E-L. And the third word on the wall is transliterated in its singular form, P-E-R-E-S. Each of those words have a one-word meaning. The first word, M-E-N-E, means numbered. Numbered. The second word, T-E-K-E-L, means weighed. And the third word, P-E-R-E-S, means divided. Numbered, weighed, divided. And then Daniel shares the meaning. He says, King, the days of your kingdom are numbered. In fact, that word M-E-N-E was on the wall twice for emphasis. It's not, in other words, Belshazzar, you think you're in control, but the truth is this. God has the days of your kingdom numbered. He already knows when it's going to end. You can't change that. By the way, do you know that's true of you and I too? Psalm 139 teaches that before you were ever born, God numbered your days. The very God who in his hand holds your life and breath. The second word, weighed, means this. You have been weighed by the holy scales of God, and you have been found deficient. You've come up short. By the way, do you know that's also true of all of us? Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And then number 3, divided. God is now going to divide your kingdom between 2 powers. In this case, it would be the Medes and it would be the Persians. And God has given you this message. Because even though you knew the story of your granddaddy, you did not learn from it. Folks, when are we ever going to learn? It's always better at the end if we simply obeyed God from the beginning. Now, in verse 29, you would think that a king, after getting a message like that, would say, off with his head. I don't like his message. But look what the king does, verse 29. Then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple. They put a necklace of gold around his neck, and they issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Ruler number 1, Nabonidus. Ruler number 2, Belshazzar. Ruler number 3, Daniel. Now, can I suggest this to you? In light of the circumstances, that was not a very good reward, because the conquering kingdom is right outside the city gates. And God's just said, you're going down. Now, you know that in that day, when one king conquered another king, what did he do to the king he conquered? He killed him, which is exactly what is going to happen to Belshazzar in a moment. And so could you imagine when they say, hey, before they come in and conquer us, I'm going to make you king too. Not a very good reward, but we'll see that it plays out for Daniel. But notice the rest of the verse, verse 30. That same night. Now that's important. Not a year later. That same night. Belshazzar knew the story of his grandfather. Remember the story? When God told Nebuchadnezzar, we saw this last week, I'm going to remove you from your kingdom. You're going to be like a wild animal in the grass. Remember that it was 12 months before that actually happened. Remember that? And I wonder if Belshazzar is sitting there going, well, maybe I got 12 months. He didn't have 12 months. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. By the way, history records that event. Not just the Bible, history does. The accounts that are out there put it in the year 539 BC. It happened somewhere between October 11th, 12th, or 13th, somewhere in there. The Persian army, assisted by the Medes, conquered the city that they thought was inconquerable. They did it in this way. The Euphrates River kind of surrounded the city like a moat of protection. So what the Medes and the Persian army did is 1.5 miles upstream, they dammed the Euphrates River so it dried up. And that became, when the water receded, it very marshy, very soft, and they were able to dig underneath the walls to get into the city, and the city was not expecting them. They were in a drunken stupor, and without even firing an arrow, they took over the kingdom, and they killed Belshazzar. And Darius the Mede becomes, you could say, the governor of the kingdom under the reign of Persian King Cyrus. Fortunately for Daniel, they do not execute him. Look at verse 1 of chapter 6. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one. Daniel gets promoted again in his 80s. And these satraps might be accountable to them, that the king might not suffer loss. And then this Daniel began to distinguish himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. He's about to get another promotion. Now, folks, here's what we're going to learn next week. When God promotes you, people attack you. When God promotes you, jealousy kicks in. We'll see that next week. But as we close out chapter 5, we have to ask the important question, and that question is, so what? I mean, it's a great story, make a great movie, right? It's riveting. But so what? Well, there's all kinds of principles we can draw from this story. But can I just share 2 with you in conclusion? One that I hope will encourage you, and one that I hope will challenge you. Here's the first principle I learned in the story. It's this. God always accomplishes his plan. Always. What happened in chapter 5, if you've been with us in this series, should not be a surprise, because God predicted it back in chapter 2 when he gave Nebuchadnezzar the dream of that big image, the image of the world powers. And the head of that image was gold, representing Babylon, but it wasn't gold all the way down, because the chest and the arms were silver, representing the Medo-Persian Empire. And in the dream, it was simply saying this: Nebuchadnezzar, your kingdom will not last forever. The Medo-Persian Empire is going to take you over. And that's what happened in chapter 5, just like God planned. And in that dream of that great image, you have the next part of the image that's made of bronze, and that represents the Grecian Empire. And the plan of God was that the Grecian Empire would take over the Medo-Persian Empire, and history records it did. And then the legs that were also there, the legs that were made of iron represented the Roman Empire, because God's plan was that the Roman Empire would then take over the Grecian Empire. And it did. God always fulfills his plan. The Babylonian Empire fell to the Medes and the Persians. That empire fell to the Grecians. That empire fell to the Romans. Now, what does that do with you and me? Here's what it does. Because in that dream, back in chapter 2, remember, there was another part of it. There was that stone not made with hands. That stone that represented Jesus Christ. That stone that represents the kingdom of God. That came and it crushed the image. And the image turned to dust. And the stone covered the whole earth, symbolizing and showing this: that all the kingdoms of man will fall, only the kingdom of God will last. And God always accomplishes his plan. So if Babylon fell, like God said it would, if the Medo-Persian Empire fell, like God said it would, if the Grecian Empire fell, like God said it would, if the Roman Empire fell, like God said it would, then you and I can know for sure that there still is coming a day when the kingdom of God will be in place, and every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. It will happen because God always accomplishes his plan. And so you can wake up tomorrow morning to start your work week, and no matter what you're facing, you can wake up with the words, "Thank God it's Monday." Because God is going to accomplish his plan in my life today, in the church today, in our world today, and I can trust him. Daniel teaches us that God accomplishes his plan. And there's a second principle. Daniel is in his 80s in this chapter. He has been in exile in Babylon for almost 70 years. He was 13, 14, 15, somewhere there when he was taken. Now, I guarantee you, when Daniel was 12 years old in Jerusalem, he had his life all planned out. It did not include Babylon. It did not include exile. He had his dreams, his ambitions, his goals. And then this trial comes into his life. And he gets exiled to Babylon, ripped away from his family, ripped away from his home, ripped away from the temple, ripped away from everything he knew, never to see it again. He would live the remainder of his life in Babylon, 70-some years. And the entire time he's there, even though his trial was not just for a season, it was for the rest of his life, he never wavered in his commitment to God. See, the truth of the matter is, folks, that very rarely does your plan A ever work out. Sometimes neither does B, C, D, E, or F. And trials come into your life. And sometimes those trials are just for a season, but sometimes those trials are the rest of your life. And maybe you're in a situation right now where this is not what I expected. This is not how I thought my life was going to go. I just want to give you this principle that I learned from Daniel. Ready? Your life's experiences cannot dictate your spiritual commitment. Your life's experiences cannot dictate your spiritual commitment. No matter what's going on in your life now, even if it's not the way you thought it would be, you continue to be steadfast, faithful, always abounding in the work of the Lord. And God has you right where He wants you. And He will use you to impact your culture through your humble courage. Jeff's going to take over up at the Sioux campus. Jack's going to take over down at the classic service. Here in our main auditorium, would you stand with me, please, for prayer? Father, whoever said that the Bible is boring has never read the book of Daniel. What a riveting story. So accurate to history. And the principles that it teaches us are life-altering. God, I pray that we would not just know your word, but that we would learn from your word, that it would affect our living. I pray that we would remember that you are a God that holds in our hand our very life, our very breath, and all of our ways. Wow. You are a God who will accomplish your plan. We can bank on that. In the end, you win, and when you win, so does your church. But God, many today find themselves in an era of their life that's not what they planned it to be. And that can be tough. I'm sure it was really tough for Daniel at times. And maybe those trials will end. Maybe they'll keep going. I don't know. But it's my prayer that no matter where you have us today, whether you have us in Jerusalem or in Babylon, I pray that our life's circumstances would never dictate our spiritual commitment. May we be strong in the Lord, because we know in the end He is Lord. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.